Hi Yogi, and welcome to another Asana Lab with me, Oceana. In today's episode, I'll be talking about yoga props, their sort of general benefits, as well as how to use some of the most common props you might encounter in your classes, and also how to substitute them with things you probably already have lying around at home. And that's just for those of you who are mostly practicing online currently but want to make sure you're fully supported in your practice. As always, I will leave you some timestamps in the video description so that you can sort of hop around this video. And it might be helpful to know that I've arranged it from starting with the props that I think are most useful to the ones that are maybe less necessary and more of a luxury item, shall we say. Now, I will also leave you a link in the video description to a collection of props that I've put together for my regular students. It's all the props that I use here in the home studio so that I can vouch for their quality. And that's just for those of you who are here because you're actually thinking about buying your own props. So we'll dive right in, and really I would say at the top of the video we have to talk about the fact that for most of us our sort of general opinion and relationship to props will very much depend on maybe which yoga lineage or which yoga teacher has brought us into the practice. For me, as I've mentioned before, I've come from quite traditional background, so within those lineages certainly the general opinion was that you should really only rely on props as long as you absolutely need to. So they were very much reserved for just beginners or students who were dealing with injuries or serious illness. So for me, I sort of developed this idea in my mind that props were very much just a crutch that, you just want to get rid of as soon as possible. And that really prevented me from sort of fully exploring my own practice and was more of a hindrance than really a benefit. And it took me finding yin yoga to really understand that there's other ways of using props and relating to them as well within classes. Because sometimes it can also feel, especially in a yoga flow class, it can feel a bit like you have to stop the class to set up your props and then continue, which I think, again, leads to some slightly negative points of view. So in terms of the benefits, yes, of course, there's the very obvious benefit that if you're a complete beginner, some postures might feel impossible or unachievable unless you use a prop to help you. But equally, for some of us, certain postures will always stay inaccessible. And that's not really a bad thing. It's just that most people's bodies have physical limitations. I know some yoga teachers who have been practicing for 40 years and their heels still don't come to the floor in a downward facing dog, and that's a-okay. Some of that is just down to how our bones are physically shaped or how our body is proportioned. So if you have very long legs, a short torso, short arms, then folding forward will always feel really tricky unless you use some props to help you. And equally, if you have a very long torso but short legs and short arms, then some back bends, especially the ones where you have to catch your feet behind your head, will feel really near impossible. So it's much more about actually accommodating for whatever is going on in our body, which might be permanent, but might also just be down to the fact that we're practicing very early in the morning rather than towards midday or evening. The body's abilities and flexibilities and muscle composition changes very much throughout the day, month, year, season, etc. So it can also just be a temporary thing. So bear that in mind. Secondly, of course, the other end of the spectrum is if you have a very advanced practice, then yoga props can actually help you to maintain the challenge in your practice. So for me, I think one of the beautiful things about yoga is really that when you're in a well-designed and well-led yoga class, everybody is struggling at the same level. So regardless of whether you're a beginner or very advanced student, you can make the same posture still stay challenging for each level of practice. So of course, yoga props can help with that. And then thirdly, I would say, as I've already mentioned, yin yoga is a good example, but we can also use props to make certain postures more restful and restorative. And there's a lot of research that has shown that there's a big difference between actively choosing to rest your body versus passive rest, which would be something like sleeping, for example, or taking a nap. In active rest, and certainly restorative yoga is a good example, what we're really trying to achieve is to really support the body as much as possible so that all of our ligaments, our muscle tissue, our cells can really relax. But ideally we're staying awake so that we can sort of allow that release to not just seep into our physical body, but also into our state of mind. And it's a sort of softening down in a way. Feeling. And finally, for me as a teacher, the benefit of incorporating props into my classes, firstly, it's a way of experimenting, of constantly keeping things fresh for my students, but also a way to make sure that all of my students are working and coming into these postures with integrity and stability, because that is really how they're going to experience the postures in the best possible way. So that's sort of my priority always. And also, just speaking from the perspective of being a teacher, again, just because of what my experience was at the beginning of my yoga journey, I always ask all of my students to get the same props at the beginning of our class, which we will then use throughout the practice. So I'm not really creating that distinction between beginners using props and then experienced students not using them, but really having a level playing field for everybody, so that we don't create these kind of negative associations in our mind. So having sort of laid that out here at the beginning, let's talk a little bit about props. So the first one I'll go into is maybe so obvious you might have forgotten that it's a prop, and that is of course the yoga mat. So the obvious reason you would use a mat is that it does provide some cushioning, especially if you have sensitive knees or wrists. That can be really helpful. But also if you buy a mat that is intended to be sticky, then it can give you a little bit of resistance, which can be useful in some postures, but also for some of us who have sort of tend towards sweatier palms or feet, which I include myself in that group of people, certainly when you're in certain postures, downward dog is a great example. You know, if you use some of the cheaper mats that you sometimes get in yoga studios, your downward dog will just gradually get longer and longer and longer until you just basically end up in a plank. So I do tend to use more sticky yoga mats personally, and really the main thing I would say for substitutions would be that, of course, you can just practice on a normal floor. If you're going to do that, especially if it's a hard floor like wood or tiles, I would suggest using a blanket for underneath your knees at least, maybe underneath your hands or wrists as well, for support and just a little bit of cushioning. If you have a carpet, that's a perfect substitute actually. Now, in terms of actually using yoga mats, I would say if you do have one that is sort of on the stickier end like this, then you do want to actually sometimes not use your mat, because the thing that sort of tends to happen is that we develop a bit of like a reliability, like a habit of using it, which, you know, the sticky mats in particular, and I have this tendency as well to use it in a way where you're really pressing, especially in the standing postures, your feet against the mat. And that very much just trains one muscle group that's, you know, sort of that sort of action of pressing out and away with your feet. And when you actually remove your yoga mat, especially if you're using a hard floor, you really need to hug the legs in towards yourself, and that can be a really beneficial experience because it sort of trains the opposite muscle group, and that just makes sure that you maintain balance in your body in terms of strength. So that's a little word of warning about using sticky yoga mats. And then we'll sort of move on to what I actually think is the most useful yoga prop. I think yoga mats are not as necessary as people make them out to be. But I think yoga bricks really, really can change our experience of our practice. Of course, you can use them within a yoga flow setting. They're quite handy and easy to move around. One yoga brick is great. If you have two, even better. You can sort of set them up either side at the front of your yoga mat. And the sort of most important thing about using them is that they technically have 3 settings. So this is the highest setting, then you have a medium setting and a lowest. And, you know, in a restorative practice, you will often use bricks to maybe prop up your bolster to give it some height, or you might also use it, for instance, to support your body. So here, as you can tell, there's a little bit of a gap between the floor and my knees. So I'm using the bricks to really support the knees here and make sure that I can stay in this posture for a longer period of time. And within a flow, you would often use the brick to support your hands for the most part, for the majority of the time. So if, for instance, I was in a low lunge here, I might use the brick underneath my hand, and then the other arm can go up into a sort of side bend extension here. And again, you could make that adjustment of the height of the brick depending on what you actually need, while still maintaining that sort of openness and the sort of general cues or benefits of that pose. But again, it can be a case that if you're very, very tall, you may need at least the highest setting, if not maybe something a little bit taller, if you're on the very, very lengthy spaghetti end of the spectrum of human beings. So those are sort of the general uses. I would say, as a rule of thumb, you can always think of yoga bricks as a way to lift the floor to where you need it to be. And in terms of substituting that, of course, the obvious choice would be books. So you can find something that sort of vaguely is the same shape as a yoga brick. And again, that can give you that support. You probably want to opt for something that's a little bit sturdy and maybe even a hardback book, but you could also use them on the flat setting as long as they're quite thick, or you could stack them, right? And that, again, can be quite versatile, because if you're stacking them, you can make them exactly the height that you want them to be, which is really helpful. And usually if you're using the books for propping yourself up in a restorative practice, books will be your best substitute for the bricks, because they're quite firmly planted into the ground, or especially if you're using a sticky yoga mat. A little bit less obvious maybe would be cans of food, which all of us will have a lot lying around at home at the moment. So you, again, could use them just one can of bricks, but they also stack quite neatly and nicely. So that's a helpful thing to, again, adjust the height of them. And what I've also done in the past is use, for example, things like Tupperware that are quite sturdy, or you can literally just wrap a bunch of cardboard boxes into each other to create a really solid base. And that can be a more permanent substitute, because you can literally make it into the exact same size and shape of a regular brick. But also I've gotten more experimental in the past when I've needed to, and used, for example, cooking pots, which you can turn upside down, and then that's a perfectly flat surface for your hand to rest on in a flow, or to support a bolster, for example. So that would be sort of my best ideas in terms of substitutions, but you can come up with your own ideas as well. Now, my personal opinion, second most important useful prop is the yoga belt. And usually, for the most part, these come as sort of one long line, and then they will have sort of buckles, some version of a buckle on one end, which you can loop the belt into so that you can create a kind of tighter loop with one long end. And oftentimes that will be useful for you to catch your foot in the smaller end of the loop, and then you might have the foot behind you, and as I said, in a back bend, and then you can walk your hands up the long end of the belt to bring the foot closer towards you from behind. My personal preference tends to be to actually use yoga belts unlooped, is that the proper word? And in that way, you can bring the belt around, let's say, for example, in a forward fold, you bring the belt around the ball of the foot. And I always like to make sure that I have enough slack on the belt so that my elbows can come all the way in towards the rib cage, and then I'm turning the palms up towards the ceiling. And the reason for that is really that there's not a lot of pulling postures where we're pulling with our arms in yoga practice, but we do a lot of pushing from the floor. So any posture where you can use a belt, it is really advisable, because you really can sort of train those muscles that support the shoulder in that pulling motion. And it's really a sort of gift we should make more use of. So even if you're super flexible, it can be really helpful to explore this different way of holding a yoga belt that sort of allows you to draw and retract your shoulder blades towards the spine. And that way you're also training a different version of your chaturanga arms, which will make your vinyasas and, let's say, inversions and things like that a lot stronger, more solid. Now, in terms of substituting, a belt is probably the easiest one to substitute. Of course, you could use a regular trouser belt. That might work. If you don't need a lot of length, you could use a sock, which works. Or, of course, much more obvious, you could use a small towel, roll it up. Or if you have, let's say, a scarf or a necktie, that also works. And again, you can just roll that up and use that as a substitution. Now, sort of the next thing I would say that they probably are sort of tied for importance, but let's start with the yoga block. So yoga blocks really are mostly used as a more forgiving basis than bricks. You'll notice that yoga bricks tend to be made out of cork, and my preference tends to be that to use blocks that are made out of foam so that they have a little bit of give and are a little bit softer for cushioning. Most of the time in a flow class, I would use these to support the sitting bones and give them a little bit more height. For most people, sitting is actually quite uncomfortable, or will cause them to round their spine, because certainly in the Western world, we're not super used to sitting on the floor all the time. So you do have to sort of accommodate for that with props. But in a restorative practice, blocks are really useful, again, just to make sure that you're sort of almost cocooning the body and making sure that there is that support. And these can be lovely because they're just a little bit more squishy for that same reason. So as you can see, these are recycled foam blocks, which I really love these. In terms of substituting them, I would actually say that substituting them with blankets or a rolled up yoga mat can really work. So for example, you could simply fold a blanket a couple of times and then slip that underneath your sitting bones to give yourself a little bit of extra height. The same thing would work if you rolled up the back of your yoga mat, or if you don't need to use your yoga mat, of course, you can also slide that underneath you. And I often also, if actually your problem, like me, is not so much flexibility, but rather being too flexible, then it can also be nice to support your knees in forward folds, for instance, if you have a tendency to sort of hyperextend and for the back of your knees to touch the ground. So you can sort of prevent injury that way. And then again, a very obvious way to substitute would be to have a sort of flatter hardback or soft or paperback book. I had to think about that for a moment. So that can also work. And then I've sort of, as I said, have tied these because I think they're quite interchangeable. But I will say that I do really, really love to use a good blanket. Now, these are just very plain organic cotton blankets that you will find in most yoga studios. I don't really like anything that has too much fluff on it because it can sort of irritate your nose. But again, blankets are super duper versatile. Most of us will have a blanket or duvet at home. You can roll them up to support you in seated positions or underneath your knees. You can, of course, cover yourself, make sure that you're warm. There's just 1,000,001 uses for blankets in yoga practice. And the substitutions, again, should be fairly obvious. You can use towels. As I said, duvets are great. If you have some bed linen that you don't currently need to use, that could be a substitution for some things. And big scarves. All of my scarves are like the size of picnic blankets. If you have a picnic blanket, that also works. Okay, and then that's probably enough ideas. We'll move on to the bolster, which as now we're kind of coming into territory of these next two items are things that I don't think you strictly need, especially if bolster is super, super bulky if you're tight for space where you live. So bolsters really are used for support. Again, you could use it kind of like a meditation cushion, so you can use them to support your sitting bones if you need a little bit more height. And actually this sort of triangle position can be really helpful for meditation for a lot of people. But oftentimes we also in yoga will use a bolster as, let's say, a way to support the spine. So if I'm just going to set up a very quick restorative back bend or restorative pose, let's say, and I could simply recline onto the bolster here and it supports my spine. So that's sort of quite a common way to use these. In terms of substituting it, I would say you could use a couple of pillows, just one on top of the other, if you have those. So you can just give yourself a little bit of height. Again, if you don't need to use your yoga mat, you can use that to support your sitting bones or knees, for instance. And then sort of the possibly easiest way is that you can use multiple blankets, or if you have a really nice thick duvet, that also works. And then you simply want to roll them all the way up. And if you're trying to make a slightly more permanent solution of this so that you can reuse it all the time, then you can also tie this up each end. And that works just as well as a regular bolster because it also has a little bit of stiffness, which is, preferable. Sometimes pillows can just sort of flop. That's the professional word for it, I'm sure. They can just sort of flop into each other. Now, finally, we'll come to what is probably my favorite yoga prop. But as I will preface, I think this is a massive luxury to have, and that is an eye pillow. Especially if you're someone who spends a lot of time in front of a computer screen or wearing glasses like I do, then actually using an eye pillow just for a couple of minutes a day can really be almost like life-changing. I dread to use that word and hype it up too much, but I do honestly love these so much. Really, the idea is that especially if you're doing restorative postures where you're reclining all the way back, you can, let's say, remove your glasses if you wear them. Usually eye pillows will have some type of like bean or pulse in them, if you can hear that. So you kind of, I tend to sort of gather it in the center and then place it on top of my eyes. And similar to how I said, there was quite a lot of research around restorative yoga and active rest versus passive rest being really useful, being really great for our physical and mental state. There's also a lot of research to show that using weights to actually sort of allows the body to release a lot quicker, which again can have a lot of benefits for us. So that's why people use weighted blankets, for example, and it can really help us ease anxiety. And so the weight of this is really what allows you to sort of soften your facial muscles, and especially if you've been frowning throughout your day, which does happen sometimes, even to yoga teachers, believe it or not. Now, in terms of substituting this, as you can tell, there might already be a sort of obvious way because they are just filled with some kind of bean. So what I've sort of prepared here is basically a freezer bag of lentils. This is sort of the only time I might advise using plastic, just because you don't want them going all over the place. If you have beeswax paper, that's great, but it can be a little bit too stiff. And you do want something that's going to basically contour your eyes completely. So because plastic isn't the nicest material, I'm going to wrap this in a soft cloth. So we simply sort of want to place this in a way that it still has a little bit of give. So you don't want to wrap it so tightly that you can't just allow it to sort of sink around. Again, you do want the eyes to be fully, comfortably contoured. So I'm going to wrap this actually fairly loosely. And again, if you do want to make this a more permanent solution, you could, again, tie up just the ends of the bag. Or if you are into sewing, you can definitely sew your own bag. And then you simply place that on top of your eyes. Maybe at the end of your practice, you give yourself just 5-10 minutes for Shavasana. And if you are sewing it, it's always good to note that most of these, when you buy them, have a little bag of beans on the inside, and then you have a cover bag on the outside so that you can wash it quite regularly, because of course if it's going on your eyes, you just want to make sure that you sort of keep it hygienic. Isn't that a lesson we've all learnt the hard way this year? And just, if you're watching this many, many years later, 2021, the year of continued coronavirus craziness. So I think that covers most of the props that I would regularly use in class. Of course, if you have anything else that I haven't covered here, then please drop me a question in the comments down below. And also, if you have a way of substituting this kind of stuff that you would like to share with everyone else, then please drop us a line, let everybody know, so that we can sort of get a little bit of an exchange going. If you like this video, of course, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, share it with your friends if you would be so kind. And if you want to find me anywhere else online, all of that information is in the video description as well. And hopefully I will see you back on your yoga mat very, very soon. Thank you for joining me. Bye, yogi.